Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be talking about a rare storm that will be developing in the Gulf of Mexico over this weekend that'll bring the threat for some significant flooding, along with much warmer temperatures to a large chunk of the country. I'll give you the latest breakdown and everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. And we're going to begin with a very impressive stationary frontal boundary. This is what's been bringing a ton of rain to really a large chunk of the United States, anywhere from the southern plains back through the mid-Atlantic region. That is where we've been seeing tons of showers and storms, and that's going to continue over the next 24 to 48 hours as flooding potential will continue to increase. Now, on the other side of the stationary frontal boundary, you might notice there's hardly any cloud cover here, and that's all due to the fact there's much drier air in place, which will make this region feel much warmer, and we have a very strong ridge that is starting to build into a large chunk of the United States. And this is really going to control our weather across the country over the next 7 days. So buckle up. Honestly, it's going to be really interesting to see what evolves here, especially on the future radar. Back down in the southeast is where I have a lot more concern over the next 7 days for the potential for some flooding, but the rest of the country doesn't look to be too bad. So when we go over this weekend, we'll be watching again a very strong ridge that'll be preventing a lot of areas from seeing showers and storms. That includes anywhere basically from Texas, primarily northern Texas. The Gulf Coast has more issues, but from North Texas back through the Great Plains and as well as even into the Northeast, this is where we're going to see, for the most part, dry weather. Once we go closer to the end of the weekend and into next week, that is when that stationary frontal boundary starts to drag further to the south. That'll bring more shower and storm activity to those in Florida, but going into next week, a rare storm could develop. Now, we're not really talking about a tropical storm, but we are watching for a subtropical storm that could develop down in the Gulf of Mexico. Look at this by Wednesday. We'll be watching for a low pressure system down in here that will bring some characteristics like a tropical storm would have, including the potential for gusty winds upwards of 40 to 50 miles per hour around this low pressure system, which will be pretty a large area near the Gulf Coast. So once we go into late Wednesday into Thursday, that is when this will slowly move off to the north, and with how slowly this is moving, the potential for flooding will increase. That's the biggest concern with this. Now, we're not talking about a category 2, 3, 4 hurricane, nothing like that, but we are watching for the potential for at least some flooding there along the Gulf Coast as we go into later next week. Now, keep in mind, with any long-term forecast, there will be some uncertainty, so things could change a little bit, but we are beginning to have more confidence that something along these lines will happen back near Florida and into Louisiana. And this will really just bring the main concern for some flooding rains, especially along the Gulf Coast, which is already what we've seen, by the way, in Louisiana over the past 24 hours. More on that here in just a moment. Once we go into next weekend, we are going to start to watch back over in the Central Plains for some development, maybe of a trough that could bring the potential for severe weather, but at this point we are still super far out from that even happening. Now, something that's happened over the last 24 hours that is quite concerning is down in southern Louisiana. Notice this area just south of Lake Charles. We actually had a couple of tornado warnings down that direction yesterday, but not just that, there have been areas upwards of 14 inches of rain in the past 24 hours. That is absolutely wild what we've seen down there just south of Lake Charles, and unfortunately more rain is to come over the next several days. Now, something that's going to be very interesting to watch over this upcoming week will be the jet stream, because we're not going to really have any big storms across the United States. In fact, you can see the jet stream, the upper level winds will not be strong at all across the country, which is fantastic news, by the way. We do not need more severe weather outbreaks or anything like that. A very strong ridge will dominate most of the country, and eventually going into late next week and even maybe into the weekend, we might get a cutoff low, which sometimes these cutoff lows can be a little bit sketchy in terms of maybe some severe weather, but again, we are still very far out from that, but something to maybe monitor as we get closer. And this is all in comparison to what we just saw this past week with that severe weather outbreak. This is what it looked like back on Wednesday. Negatively tilted trough that pulled a ton of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico with very strong upper level winds. It created havoc with massive hailstorms, lots of damaging winds, and also tornadoes. Luckily, we have nothing like that in our future, which is fantastic news. Again, we do not need more severe weather here in the United States. Now, in terms of what's coming up though over the next several days, it's not really fantastic news. We're still going to be watching for a stationary frontal boundary through at least tomorrow, if not maybe Sunday. We'll still have some showers and maybe some storms out there, but a lot of this does clear out and actually move into Florida as we go into Sunday. Now, once we go into next week, again, we're going to be monitoring maybe a subtropical development just south of Louisiana. This will be something to watch for some flooding, maybe going into Thursday or Friday, but this does not seem to be overly significant at this time, which again is great news, but it is still something to watch for, because if it does slow down a bit, we might see really significant rainfall in some areas, at least in isolated locations. As I mentioned mentioned earlier, the wind gusts out of this will be somewhat similar to a tropical storm. They might actually get upwards of 30 to 40 miles per hour right along the Gulf Coast, but again, where that actually happens is kind of uncertain, and this is nothing that's that crazy. Again, we're not really looking at anything that crazy. Even though it's a bit of a rare storm, it's not like a tropical storm or hurricane or anything that crazy in that sort of regard. Now, in terms of rainfall accumulation as we go throughout even next week, again, this is a long-term projection, so things could change, but over the next 7 to 10 days, we'll be watching for most of the rainfall to be right here along the Gulf Coast, and as well as back through the Carolinas, a couple of areas to monitor for some heavier rainfall, which again, some isolated flash flooding will exist as we even go into next week. A lot of you might be wondering, will it be a nice upcoming week in terms of the temperatures? Well, for some parts of the country, it will be really nice, depending on what you consider nice, to be honest with you, because as we go into next week, there will be a pretty large heat wave, especially across the northern part of the country, back near the Midwest and the northern plains. That is where that ridge will basically be originating, and that is where we're going to see some much warmer and as well as drier air, which will make areas back up in the Midwest feel as warm as the 70s and maybe 80s. So temperatures will get quite warm. We might see some record-breaking temperatures as well. And once we go into next weekend, which is still far out from now, no big changes at this point in comparison to what I said yesterday. Maybe some cooler weather in the Midwest if we get a little trough going, but other than that, nothing really that significant in terms of temperatures is ahead. And the Climate Prediction Center has basically said the same thing, at least going through Thursday into next Monday, which is not this week, that's next week. Temperatures are expected to be well above average in parts of the Northeast and as well as back into the Midwest. Make sure to like the video and as well as subscribe if you've not already. This forecast is brought to you by Platinum Contracting.